All right, so I would like to welcome everyone once more to our webinar for 2024 for the Movement for Liberation from Nakba. And the webinar is titled Zionism 2024, Where To? The core concept of this webinar, the message that we want to actually ask, and the question that we want to ask in doing this webinar, in this conversation, will regard on the present Gaza crisis and situation on the day after. The question of the day after in regards to the genocidal policies of the Israeli state against the Gaza Strip. So starting from the events from 7th October 2023 to the contemporary setting, we will be asking our panelists and also questions from our respective audience to actually ponder on the historical and moral context and mainly focus on the question of what next, what will be the next thing going forward for the Palestinian people. With that, I would like to pass the floor to our moderator, Dr. Nida Arif, who is with us today. So Dr. Nida, the floor is yours.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to our audiences across the globe. I would not rehash the situation with an account of numbers in Gaza, for the audience here, I believe, are quite aware of the scale of destruction and loss meted out to Palestinian people in Gaza in one of the most brutal episodes in the long history of suffering and resilience. If there is a silver lining to all this horror that has been unleashed in recent past, then it could only be that Israel's genocidal nature has never been more apparent to the world, even to the governments of the global north, the proverbial ostriches with their heads buried in colonialism and white supremacy. We would try to locate the prison break of October 7 within the wider and historical within the wider and historical moral context in our discussion today. And as Hassan said, what could be the next is what we are going to be pondering about. What could be the next for the region and the world? How could what we call global Palestine, defined loosely as a coalition of people's movement across the world against the oppressive governments and colonialism within the cross-section of Palestinian national movement, can prevail over global Israel? Defined loosely as a coalition made of governments, parliaments, mainstream media, multinational corporations, security companies, military industry, industrial complex, Christian Zionists, Zionist Jewish communities, etc. So, and thereafter, what about the days after the next? What could be the possible visions for the distant future? But all these are on plate for us today. And we have a very distinguished panel here to help us ponder on these questions. The first of our speakers, of our three speakers, is Professor Ilan Pape. And Professor Ilan Pape is an expatriate Israeli historian and activist. He's a professor with the College of Social Sciences and International Studies at the University of Exeter in the United Kingdom, Director of University European Center for Palestine Studies, and co-director of the Exeter Center for Ethnopolitical Studies. Professor Pape is particularly well regarded for his work on challenging Israeli state narrative about its establishment and conclusively proving that the expulsion of Palestinians in the Israeli-Arab War 1948 or the inauguration of what is called ongoing Nakba since then constituted ethnic cleansing in accordance with Planned Talent. His book include 10 myths about Israel, the biggest prison on earth, a history of occupied territories, the idea of Israel, the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, and history of modern Palestine, one land, two people. And I urge you all to please check these books out. They are very good. Professor Pape,
Thank you, Nida. Thank you.
The floor is yours, Professor Pape. You each will have 15 minutes.
10 minutes?
Oh.
Good. Excellent.
15 minutes.
Sorry, 15 minutes. Sorry, Professor Pape, your screen is sideways.
I think.
Sideways and it's not good.
Yeah.
Can we do it like this?
Yeah.
Is that better?
Yeah, perfect. All right.
Okay, fantastic. Great. Thank you so much, Hassanel, Nida, Rajan, and all the team that made this webinar possible. I know that many of you who are viewing us or listening to us or would view it a bit later as a recording have already been attending similar webinars and meetings, but I do think that there always is a space for more profound, more expanded, and different angles to what I can say also from my life experience and as an historian, is the worst chapter in the history of modern Palestine. I devoted my life to the research on what I thought was the most catastrophic year in the history of modern Palestine, 1948, the Nakba. We created this movement, this website, and this outfit as Liberation from Nakba. But we were always aware that not only was 48 a horrific chapter of dispossession, oppression, and colonization, we were always aware that we are dealing and engaging with something that the Palestinians call al-Nakba al-Mustamirra, the ongoing Nakba. But I don't think we imagined that the ongoing Nakba would have a chapter which is worse than the original Nakba itself. And I'm afraid in every parameter, in terms of number of dead, in the level of carnage and destruction, and given that this is the 21st century where people know every detail of what's going on, which was not the case in 1948, this is even more horrendous and a moment of great apprehension and worry about the future. What I would like actually to say is that within this dark moment in the history of modern Palestine, we sometimes forget that historically, moments of disasters, moment of despair, moment of terrible cruelty and ruthlessness can also produce something different or a better future, not immediately, but in a longer trajectory. And I would like to talk about that possibility that this horrific moment in the history of Palestine carries with it some opportunities for the future that I would like to talk about, and are, if I summarize them in one sentence, I would say that the events of the 7th of October, and not just the events of the 7th of October itself, the last 3 months, and in fact also the 2 years preceding the 7th of October, exposed indications that actually the project of Zionism is then in the beginning of the end of its existence. I stress the beginning of the end. And why do I would like to say that it's the beginning of the end? Because that's very important for me to stress. Because as historically, I'm aware that uh, uh, trajectories of disintegration, decolonization, collapse of political entities, disappearance of political entities, all these can take time, and they don't happen in a day or in 2 days. So the beginning of an end can be a decade, can be 15 years, but nonetheless, you can detect the processes that eventually implode such a project like Zionism from within, aided by certain developments from the outside. And I think we are already witnessing some discrete processes of the implosion from within the Zionist project, some fundamental changes in the region and in the world, that I think one day these discrete processes would fuse together into a very powerful transformative event that might lead us to a very different Palestine, historical Palestine, in the future. It is another caveat that one should add, that not only it can be a long process of ending a project or disintegration of a project, it's also a very dangerous moment because outfits, regimes, institutions that are losing their grip, that are losing validity, that are losing the power to survive, fight for their own life. And in that fight, they become ruthless, and even more ruthless than before, and intransigent and dangerous. And we have seen it in the fall of South Vietnam. We have seen it in the fall of apartheid South Africa, and there are other quite important historical examples I don't have time to go into. So it's both a longer period, too long, unfortunately, and a dangerous one, but nonetheless one that I think carries with it some hope for the future. So let me talk about 4 or 5, as much as the time would allow me, indications, I call them, that point to the disintegration of the project, the settler colonial project of Zionism, as you know, that began in the late 19th century. It was basically, like all settler colonial projects, a project of displacing the indigenous native people and replacing them with immigrants and settlers from Europe, and later with settlers from the Arab and Muslim world. In the process, in 1948, this Zionist movement and later the State of Israel expelled half of Palestine's population, destroyed half of its villages, most of its towns, continued ethnic cleansing operations in the wake of the '67 war, when it began when it was able to annex areas, or occupy rather, areas of Palestine it was unable to occupy in '48, and therefore the ethnic cleansing continued during the '67 war and since the '67 war until today. And of course, we are witnessing in the last 3 months the attempt to get rid of the Gaza population as part of that idea that you need to have as much of Palestine as possible with as few Palestinians in it as possible. So what are the indications? The first indication was already there before the 7th of October. This was a kind of a civil war inside Israel between what you can call, what I call at least, the state of Judea, which is the state of the settlements, born in the settlements of the West Bank, wishing to make Israel more theocratic, more racist, more religious, more Zionist, but in a messianic way, caring very little for democracy or for the international image of Israel. And it was in a direct confrontation with what I call the State of Israel, the more secular, liberal, mostly European Jews who wanted to create a pluralist democratic society in Israel, while not at all minding the continuation of the occupation of the Palestinians in the West Bank, or the siege in the Gaza Strip, or the discrimination, the institutional discrimination against the Palestinian citizens of Israel. It turned out the cement that holds together these two camps, the idea that Judaism is religion, or the Judaism is nationalism, that cement seems to melt and doesn't hold water anymore. It doesn't keep the two sides together unless there is a constant situation or condition of war, violence, and bloodshed. And it's a very good question whether the message for the young Israelis, to the children, to the grandchildren, to the next generation of Jews in Israel in the 21st century, which is honestly articulated by all the Israeli leaders and politicians, whether from the opposition or the government, is that the next 50 to 70 years are years of war, bloodshed, and conflict. In fact, also admitting that this is the only thing that holds the Jewish society together. I don't think that this is going to be maintained in the longer run. The second indication is the change in the world public opinion, especially in the civil society, also among some governments in the global south. One can talk about a global Israel alliance that includes most of the government of the global north, multinational corporations, security firms, military industries, Jewish communities, Christian Zionists, evangelical communities, some governments, unfortunately, also in the global south, that gives Israel immunity to continue its policies. Very little moral validity is part of that alliance. It's all about very narrow and cynical, and sometimes would say narrow interests, strategic interests, economic interests, here and there religious ideologies. But I think that this is not going to hold on for too long. Israel may prove not to be an asset. And it is confronted by what one can call global Palestine, an alliance that was particularly powerful since in this century compared to the previous century. Civil societies around the world, minorities, people who are oppressed, people who feel that the struggle for justice in Palestine represents their own struggles for justice, and they created few powerful movements of solidarities around the idea of boycott, divestment, and sanctions of Israel. I think that The move of South Africa in the International Court of Justice is the beginning of the move between what one can call in the boycott, divestment, and sanction movement, the BDS, the move from the B and D, the boycott and the divestment, to the sanctions. And this will have a huge effect on the reality on the ground and the survival of the Zionist project. A third indication is the change, in particular among the Jewish community, especially the younger generation, and in particular in the United States. Um, I do predict that more and more young Jews in the future, I mean, those who are young today will probably be more grown-ups in the future, would feel less and less identification with Israel, would less and less buy into the idea that Israel is the insurance state that makes sure that if there is another Holocaust or waves of anti-Semitism, Jews have where to go to. I think people understand that the most dangerous place for Jews in the world is Israel, and the Jewish communities would rather join movements of change in their own countries to make it a better world, rather than choose the continued colonization and oppression of Palestine. A fourth indicator is what we call in economics the microeconomics of Israel. Macroeconomics in Israel is still very impressive, and you can see it in the report of the OECD. That Israel did well in the crisis of 2008 and even during the time of the COVID-19 pandemic. However, if you go to the microeconomics, if you see the gap between those who have and those who haven't, if you are aware of the fact that very few Israelis can afford to buy a flat or a house, if you see how many Israelis every year join the people who are under the poverty line, you can understand that the huge expenditures on military, on security, despite the assistance from the United States, is not enough to hold the level of living or standard of living that most Israeli Jews were used to. And it seems that this would be aggravated in the future with the continued conflict. Another indication, and I just give another two, and with this I will end my contribution, is the fact that the Palestinian national movement, after years of dissent, fragmentation, caused mainly by the geographical separation imposed on the Palestinian people by the Zionist movement, is now transforming the whole agenda of the Palestinian liberation movement, partly because young people have an ability to communicate in this world of internet that was not available for the older generation. I think they're far more united and consensual in their vision of the future. They're not yet organized, but I think this organization will emerge eventually. And I think that kind of powerful transformation of the Palestinians will make them ready, if I'm right, that the disintegration of Zionism would occur, because otherwise, if they are not going to fill the vacuum of the disintegration, this could be a very long and terrible period of chaos that can be extended, can go on for very long. So one would hope that I'm right about this indication, because it would be very important in transforming the reality on the ground. Last but not least of the indication is, of course, the position of the Global South. And I think part of what we do in the MLN is try and disseminate these ideas, in particular in the Global South. We believe that the Global South can play a far more effective and important role, and I think it will. And the moment it will do that, I think we will see that it will have the power not only of stopping carnage, ethnic cleansing, and oppression, but hopefully, and I think this historically can be proven by legacies and tradition in the Global South, by helping whoever lives in historical Palestine and whoever was expelled from historical Palestine to move to the future through mechanism of restorative justice rather than retribution, to minimize the level of violence that usually is accompanying transformations from colonization to decolonization. In many ways, the fact that Palestine is still not decolonized, it can benefit from all the bad examples of decolonization, like the economic crisis in South Africa, like the emergence of authoritarian regimes in Africa itself. I think there's a lot to be learned from history here to make the model of decolonization in historical Palestine a far more positive one, a far more successful one. And I think what really is intriguing for me is the fact that the younger generation, not only of Palestinians, but also people in the neighboring Arab states, are not looking to Europe, to the nation state models of the Westphalian model of Europe as the model that would ensure better life for Palestinians and even Jews in historical Palestine. They're looking back into their own past, into their own tradition, into the periods of coexistence, a genuine coexistence between collective groups who cherish the collective group as well as the individual rights, and building out of that legacy a model that I would think would not only influence life in Palestine, but would radiate and influence the whole of the Mashriq or the Eastern Mediterranean, or from the way we look at it from Asia, the whole of West Asia. And hopefully this human capital that the Palestinians always possessed would be reinvested back into historical Palestine, and also would be helpful to build a different Arab world in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Pape. The next speaker that we have is Professor Joseph Camilleri. Professor Joseph Camilleri is an emeritus professor at Lathrop University in Melbourne, a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia, and convener of Conversation at the Crossroads. He is the founding director of the Lathrop Center for Dialogue, which specializes on research and training in the management of cultural, religious, and political tensions within and between countries. He has authored, the very prolific Professor Joe has authored or edited over 30 books, written 120 book chapters and journal articles. His research has focused on security studies, international political economy, the foreign policies of the great powers, the international relations of the Asia-Pacific region, and the philosophy, method, and practice of dialogue. Importantly, he explored the complexities of governments in an era of rapid transition. His two notable works are The End of Sovereignty and Worlds in Transition, both of which he co-authored with Jim Falk. Since 2000, Professor Camilleri has convened some 20 major international dialogues and conferences and appeared before several parliamentary and government inquiries. He serves on several advisory boards and for last 20 years chaired the editorial board of the journal Global Change, Peace and Security. Please check that journal out. He is the recipient of several awards, including St. Michael's Award for Distinguished Service to the Community, the Victorian Premier Award for his contribution to community harmony, and the Order of Australia Medal for service to the community and international relations as a scholar, educator, and advocate. So we have Professor Joe here. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you very much, Nida. It's a pleasure to be taking part in this webinar, a very important initiative of MLN, which I'm very pleased to be associated with. A pleasure on the one hand, but of course, we're in the midst of an unfolding tragedy in Gaza, as we all know, and it's continuing as Israeli forces continue to wreak havoc on Palestinian land and to inflict, as we all know, untold suffering on the people of Gaza. But I feel that in the midst of this tragedy, and this follows on to a considerable extent on what Professor Pape was saying, in the midst of crisis, it's time to take stock and to plan for the future, both the short-term future as well as the longer-term future. People have said that Israel, at least the state of Israel, the current government of Israel, has gone into this adventure without much thought as to what would follow it. That may well be true, but we must make sure that those who oppose this aggression against the people of Palestine themselves are giving appropriate thought to that future. And this is the thinking that underlies the initiative, which is known by its acronym SHAPE, Saving Humanity and Planet Earth, which Dr. Chandra, who's going to speak shortly, Professor Richard Falk and I helped to initiate back in 2022. Of course, SHAPE has a much wider brief, but events in Israel, Palestine presently figure very prominently in our analysis of world events and in our program. First, let me say a word about the 84-page South African submission, which has documented in harrowing detail the genocidal conduct and intent of the Israeli state, both its political and military arms. In this sense, I think it can be said that the South African initiative serves as an exemplary initiative for which it must be commended and given full support. But there is one thing, and this is not meant as a criticism, which the South African submission to the ICJ does not draw attention to. And that's what I call the crimes of complicity. What do I mean by that? I'm referring to the former colonial powers and the settler colonial states, one of which went on to become the world's leading, and in some respects, perhaps the most dangerous imperial power. And so these Western states, so-called liberal democratic states, have failed by their refusal to prevent genocide or to stop it once it got underway. And more than 100 days later, they are still refusing to act, even though acting is a central obligation of the Genocide Convention, of which many of them are parties, most of them. Some states, notably the United States, but also the UK and regrettably Germany, have actively supported and facilitated the continuation of the genocidal onslaught. What does this response of the global West tell us? First, and most importantly, it exposes the hypocrisy and the duplicity of the political elites of these countries and the powerful military, industrial, and financial interests which underpin these elites. In other words, it exposes the contribution between, on the one hand, the claims repeatedly made by these elites that they occupy the high moral and legal ground, and the presumption that they can lecture the states and the peoples of the global South about respect for human rights, international law, and human life more generally. So on the one hand, we have that, and on the other hand, active support for what Professor Richard Falk has called one of the most transparent genocides in human history. What kind of support? Well, certainly moral support for the fictitious argument of self-defense. Diplomatic support, of course, including vetoing urgently needed UN Security Council resolutions. Military support of all kinds, including weapons and munitions. Generous access to intelligence, and the forward projection of large-scale military power in the Red Sea and beyond. So the question arises, where to from here? Of course, we have to start with the state of Israel and the genocidal violence it has unleashed since October 7. The behavior can only be described as barbaric, and the state that has planned and executed these barbaric actions can only be described now as corrupt to the core. This state, in so doing, has placed itself, by its stated intentions, by its plans, its brutal actions, outside the bounds of a civilized world. Israel effectively has made itself a pariah state and must therefore be treated as such by the international community. That's one of the key messages I want to put to you. And as we have seen, the crime doesn't end there, because in this crime, there are accomplices. These are the states in the global West, and the crime must be stopped, and the criminal and its accomplices must be brought to account. Simply put, it's not enough to denounce this reality, this inhuman reality. It's time to envision an alternative reality and to embark, small step by small step, on a bold response underpinned by a carefully crafted and well-integrated strategy. A strategy that covers the short, medium, and longer-term objectives and initiatives. A strategy, secondly, that targets states, international institutions, and importantly, civil society. First, a quick word about the more immediate steps. First, governments everywhere must apply maximum pressure for a permanent ceasefire and wholesale economic reconstruction in Gaza, to be funded by Israel and its principal Western backers, and driven by and under the direct supervision of the Palestinian people. And so civil society, not least in the global West, must demand several specific things of their government. In other words, protests, campaigns, actions should, wherever necessary, target the government of where those protests, actions, and initiatives are taking place. To join immediately, if they have not already done so, in the call for a ceasefire. And two, to stop all forms of diplomatic, economic, and military support for Israel's use of force in Gaza and the West Bank until such time as a permanent ceasefire has been agreed to. And three, to support firmly South Africa's application to the ICJ. This is the global West. And then we need to turn, of course, we have to turn our attention also, and importantly, to the rising global South. And here too, we must keep in mind the role of governments on the one hand, and civil society on the other. And two things need to be kept in mind. First, we have the Arab world, then the Muslim world more widely, and then other parts of the global South, each with distinct roles to play. And the second thing to keep in mind is that many of these governments have used relatively strong language. In some cases, not perhaps strong enough, but nevertheless, some strong language. But the publics in Arab and other Muslim countries must demand more than just words. They must demand actions. And unfortunately, even Arab governments have been loud on words and much softer when it comes to action. This must be exposed publicly and in those countries themselves where civil society is able to function. What can we expect reasonably of these governments in the Arab world, in the Muslim world, and then in the other parts of the global South? What can we expect of these governments, of key multilateral bodies, and especially the Arab League, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, but also BRICS, and not forgetting the non-aligned movement as a whole? First, we should expect them to spearhead soon and on a continuing basis a series of sharply worded resolutions at the UN, including the Security Council, not with a view to gaining victory in terms of the resolution itself passing, certainly in the Security Council, though it should not pose a problem in the General Assembly, but the point being first and foremost to demonstrate the moral and diplomatic isolation of Israel and its principal backers. The name of the strategy is called Isolate, 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 Marginalize. Secondly, we expect of these governments to give firm, practical, as well as moral support to South Africa's application to the ICJ. Thirdly, we expect support, strong support by these governments for the attempt to bring Israel to the attention of the International Criminal Court so that the relevant individuals who have authorized these barbaric crimes can be brought to justice. Next, we can expect them to sever or at least suspend diplomatic relations with the State of Israel, which a few have done, but a great many have not yet done. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, to take the lead in launching an international campaign for an international embargo on arms sales and other forms of military assistance to Israel, as was the case with the anti-apartheid movement many years ago. Very successful campaign. And the second front has to do with the longer-term strategy of creating conditions necessary for a just and sustainable peace. Conditions for which must be respectful of Palestinian rights and independence under international law. And here, civil society everywhere, in all parts of the world, has a vital role to play. NGOs, religious cultural organizations, labor unions, professional bodies, small businesses, engaged citizens in all walks of life, including poets, artists, intellectuals, teachers, students, unionists, lawyers, doctors, architects, and many others. To implement, what can they do? To implement actions within their spheres of influence, supportive of Palestinian rights, including campaigns directed at mainstream media. Secondly, thought can be given to establishing internationally a non-governmental commission, independent, whose brief would be to consult widely and support Palestinian groups and intellectuals and young people as they work towards, over time, a detailed transition to a new Palestine-Israel reality that fully respects the rights of the Palestinian people to self-determination and to undoing the wrongs of the past. Thirdly, an idea that may be worth considering, internationally establishes a panel comprised of eminent jurists, other experts, representatives of civil society organizations, to consider ways in which the UN system can function more effectively on this issue than it has thus far. To examine every avenue within the UN system, and in particular at the UN Security Council, but importantly the General Assembly, where the power of veto cannot be exercised. And within that, the possibility of using a uniting for peace mechanism, modeled on Resolution 377A, which was brought into effect in relation to the Korean War. And also UN agencies, and importantly, the Office of the UN Secretary General. And finally, how space can be given within the UN system right now for a more prominent, concerted, and sustained role on the part of civil society within the UN system. Now, for all of this to prove at all effective, and I conclude with this main point, the thrust of these proposals must derive, first and foremost, from the deliberations of Palestinian groups and individuals everywhere, which means that they need to think of coming together as a matter of urgency, establishing working groups, arranging consultations of various kinds within Palestine and internationally, preparing discussion papers, and all of this to culminate, one would hope, in one or a series of inclusive, dramatic conferences, and the process to continue for as long as it takes for a consensual roadmap to emerge. At the end of the day, pro-Palestinian mobilization will succeed only if it is inspired by, nurtured by, and can work in tandem with organized Palestinian resistance at home and in the diaspora, internationally coordinated. In this sense, the tragedy that has befallen the people of Gaza is a time of crisis, which means a time of high risk, but I suggest also great opportunity. It is our collective responsibility right now to muster collaboratively all the wisdom and ingenuity we can command to minimize the risks and seize the opportunities which now present themselves, and do it as fast as our energies will allow us to do, sooner rather than later. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Campbell, for with a lot of specifics about what can be done in just immediate future with regard to the situation in Palestine. The next speaker that we have is Dr. Chandra Muzaffar. Dr. Chandra Muzaffar is the president of the International Movement for a Just World, or as the acronym is JUST, an international NGO based in Malaysia which seeks to critique global injustice and to develop an alternative vision of a just and compassionate civilization guided by universal spiritual and moral values. He has published extensively on civilizational dialogue, international politics, religion, human rights, and Malaysian society. In 1977, he founded a multi-ethnic social reform group called Aliran Kesidaran Negara. Aliran, I hope I'm not butchering the pronunciation, which he led for 14 years. He was a professor and director of the Center for Civilizational Dialogue, the University of Malaya between the years 1997 to 1999, and a professor of global studies at University Sam Malaysia between the years 2007 and 2012. The author and editor of some 32 books in English and Malay, many of his writings have been translated into other languages. Among Dr. Muzaffar's latest publications are A World in Crisis, Is There a Cure? And Reflection on Malaysian Unity and Other Challenges. Today, apart from his role in JUST, Professor Muzaffar sits on the board of a number of international NGOs concerned with social justice and civilizational dialogue. As a side note, for those of us who are fed up with ethno-philosophy of European philosopher, Dr. Muzaffar is a great place if you are contemplating within the political sphere the notions of universality, international cooperation. So do please check out his writings. So Dr. Muzaffar, the floor is yours now.
Thank you very much, Nita. Fellow panelists, Professor Ilan Pape, Professor Joseph Camilleri, organizers of this webinar, Hassanal, Ranjan, and all the others who have helped with this webinar. Peace be with you. Since both Prof. Ilan Pape and Professor Joseph Camilleri have covered a lot of the important issues that a webinar of this sort should discuss, I'll be brief and focus on 3 points in my presentation. Point number 1 concerns the global West in relation to Palestine and the struggle of the Palestinian people. It is remarkable what they have done, a segment of the global West, meaning by which the public in the last few weeks, the way they've articulated their opposition to what Israel has done, especially given the power of the Israeli media, and the way in which for many, many decades, when it comes to the question of Palestine, the Israeli media has ensured that the West, the global West, will listen to only one particular narrative. And to a great extent, they've succeeded. Given that backdrop, I think what has happened recently is really out of the ordinary. The protests in so many different Western capitals, the mobilization, the positions adopted by various groups, and in particular, the Jewish population, young Jews in particular. And they have taken a position against the Israeli state, taken a position against Zionism, openly, publicly, which many of them were reluctant to do in the past. And they have linked hands with groups that have been fighting the Palestinian cause in many parts of the global south, which I think is a very important development that we should give close attention to. All that is wonderful. But I have a feeling that more can be done. And in fact, the global West, the public, the ordinary people, they hold the key to the tragedy that has confronted us since the 7th of October. When I say they hold the key, what I mean is that if tomorrow the masses, general public, in what are democracies, many of these countries, United States, Canada, Britain, France, Germany, all these countries, if the democratic community comes forward and says that this is what we demand, not just demonstrate, not just make speeches here and there, or even the network, go beyond all that and make it very clear that they expect this to be done within a certain time frame. Otherwise, they're withdrawing their support from the government. In an election year, it means a lot when you say you're withdrawing your support, that you will put this to the test in the case of the United States of America in the primaries that have started, that you will put forward candidates outside the two major parties who stand for justice, not just for the Palestinians at this particular juncture, but justice for the majority of humankind, because that is what the Palestinian struggle is all about. You really reflect upon the struggle, the issues that are embedded in the struggle. It is about humanity. It's about all of us. It is about colonialism, about racism. It is about what democracy really means. It is about how the ordinary citizen can play a role in shaping his or her future. That's what this struggle is all about. And if they can stand up and say, those in the West who have the space, who have the scope, can stand up and say, look, this is our demand. And we demand that our leaders act in this manner. And if they don't, this is what we will do. In other words, let us see something of what happened in the protest against the Vietnam War amongst the American public and the Western public. Let us see them demonstrate that they've got the guts and the gumption, they've got the courage and the conviction to ensure that there will be change. And the rallying point for this is something very straightforward and simple that all of us can identify with. That at the heart of this tragedy in Palestine is the massacre of children. This is what it is. And it's never happened in this manner before. Of course, children have been killed many, many wars. We know that. But the way in which it has been done in a systematic manner, the percentage of the total number of people who have been killed, if you look at what's happening in Gaza, compared to the percentage of children killed in almost every other war, in almost every other conflict, this is really out of the ordinary. That more than 1/3 of those who have been killed are children. More than 10,000 at the last count who have been killed. Children. And when I say children here, it's babies in their cot right up to 16 and 17-year-olds. Brutal massacre of children. Surely we can make this the rallying point. And the West can take this up, can't they? All those who are protesting and say, look, this is what is at stake. We should put a stop to this immediately. There's no tomorrow or day after. It should be done immediately. Because this is totally unacceptable to humankind. If you've got a conscience, if you've got a sense of justice, if there is an iota of humanity in us, we cannot allow this. And believe me, friends, this is deliberate. It's not an accident. The fact that in almost every massacre that has taken place since 1948 and in 1948 too, since 1948, if you look at the 6 assaults on Gaza, isn't it significant that there's a large percentage of children and women who have been killed? Because they represent the future. They represent the ability of a society, of a community to procreate and to ensure that it continues its journey. And this is being done deliberately to send a message to the Palestinians and to others that this is what we are doing. We are exterminating, we are annihilating your community. There is no need to prove this through laws and rules and all the rest of it. This is genocide. This is targeted. This is a good example of ethnic cleansing, which has been part of the agenda of Israel, and even before the state of Israel was created. If you look at some of the writings of people in the 1920s and so on, those who were champions of the Zionist cause. And if you look at major Zionist writers, they had already talked about exterminating the Palestinians. They'd already talked about taking over the land. You know, and there's this foolish notion that here we are coming to Palestine, land without a people, for a people without a land. This has conditioned their thinking all along, which means as far as the Palestinians are concerned, they don't exist. And that itself is a very important dimension of colonial discourse. In colonial discourse, the non-whites, the colonized, they don't count. They're not human beings. And let's not forget that if you look at some of the other colonial outfits, if you look at the settler communities, Australia is an outstanding example. I'm sure Joe is very much aware of this. When they killed the native population, the first peoples in Australia, their killings were described in some quarters as kangaroo hunting, hunting and killing kangaroos, because that is how they saw those human beings. And it had gone on for a long while. In fact, if you look at the White Australia policy and this dimension of racism, in a sense, it existed right until 1967 in Australia. And these are countries which claim to be great democracies and great champions of human rights and so on. So I think this is a very important challenge. We would like to see our friends in the West, in the global West, do more than what they have already done, which is commendable, but there is scope for much more action. And they will make a difference. They will make a difference if they back it up with concrete action. And they can prove it through elections and through other means of action. That's the first point. The second point I want to make is linked to the Arab governments and groups in the Arab world and in the Muslim world. A number of them have made statements. They've expressed their concern, it's true. But if you compare them even to some of the Western governments, what they have done is utterly shameful. Utterly shameful. You have a leading Arab government. I shall not mention the name here, but people know this, which condemns what is happening because everyone else is condemning what is happening in Gaza, which takes a certain position, but at the same time acts as a conduit for supplying arms to Israel. And if you look at the track record of this particular government, it is utterly disgraceful. But this sort of attitude amongst Arab and Muslim leaders is not unusual. They play this game all the while. They say one thing to their people because they know what popular sentiments are like, and they do something else in terms of preserving their interests. Because for many of them, their future, their stability, their ability to continue to rule and dominate their people depends upon Western leaders, depends upon Western armies. They know that. And for that reason, they play this game. And they continue to do it, even in the midst of this crisis in Gaza. This is what they're doing. Can you imagine, as a couple of writers have pointed out, what they can do if they're sincere? If they're sincere. You take, for instance, the control that some of these governments exercise over important waterways. There's something called the Suez Canal. It's such a critical aspect of international trade. You just have to shut down the Suez for just a week, and you'll see a tremendous change in the attitude of a number of Western governments. The fact that they've reacted the way they've done in the case of the Red Sea, the Houthis, which is not a major military force, but they've got the guts, they've got the courage, and what they've done has sent shivers down the spines of Western governments, the Houthis. But if others are involved, more powerful governments, and if they're organized and they do it together, it could be tremendous. Suez Canal, the Nile, Straits of Hormuz, and a number of other waterways in that region. Such a major dimension of international trade. They can close down those waterways and say, this is what we'll do. We will close it down for a while. We will open it the moment you stop killing people in Gaza, which is what the Houthis have been saying. The Houthis have just targeted Israeli ships. They've not targeted any other ship. Chinese and Russian ships and Indian ships and others are passing through, but it is just the Israeli ships that they have targeted. And the demand is very simple. Stop the bombardment of Gaza. Stop it now, and we will immediately cease our action against Israeli ships. Is the Western media demanding this? No. Are media channels in the Arab and Muslim world talking about this? They're not. Are they even giving prominence to this? They're not. They know that these demands are being made, but they don't even discuss this in their own newspapers. Which newspaper in Indonesia or Malaysia has talked about what the Houthis are doing or linked it with what is possible vis-a-vis the Suez, the Nile, vis-a-vis the other waterways, the Straits of Hormuz and so on? Who is talking about this? Who is discussing this? Who is trying to mobilize public opinion on this? It's not happening. Because this is real action. And the media in all these countries, which are subservient to the ruling elites, they're not prepared to do this. They will carry other meaningless, nonchalant statements here and there. But a thing like this, they will never discuss with their media. Show me one media, even in the Arab world, at this moment, Egypt, in Qatar, in Al Jazeera has got its home. You look at all the media, would they talk about this in depth and say, look, let's mobilize on this. Let's awaken mass consciousness on this? They will not. So this is the game they play. This is the game they play. This are the waterways. There's yet another very strategic weapon in their hands, oil. The vast majority of oil that is traded in the world flows beneath Muslim feet. But what are they doing? What are they doing? Even in the midst of this crisis, we know that oil reaches Israel from Muslim countries through Muslim countries that act as channels, as conduits. Not just as producers of oil, but the oil is transported through other Muslim states who make a lot of noise, who give the impression that they're great fighters. The truth is that they're also playing the game. Of course, there are economic considerations and other considerations, but in a situation like this, you have to show some guts. And there had been a bit of this in the past. Don't forget, in 1973, during the Arab-Israeli War, 2 Arab states stood up, different in terms of the orientation. Libya under Muammar Gaddafi and Saudi Arabia under King Faisal. They stood up, and the reactions in the Western capitals. You had Henry Kissinger, the whole lot of them, rushing to these places and to those who were going to act as middlemen to persuade them not to continue with their boycott of oil. They denounced a boycott, and these were 2 major oil producers. And at least one of them had begun to implement its intention. And that was enough. That was enough to frighten the Western capitals. And oil is a huge weapon, a huge weapon. Just 1 week, some even argue that just 2 days of turning off the oil tap, that would be enough to bring about a change. And here you have this massacre of children that is taking place, much worse than anything that has happened before. And yet, you find that they're not using these weapons. They continue to play their game. All of them have maintained their diplomatic missions, those that have diplomatic missions in Israel. There's been no change, a whole lot of them, with the exception of Jordan and perhaps 1 or 2 others. But generally, they've all kept their missions in place. These are the Arab and Muslim countries. And the country that had taken the initiative in terms of making a submission to the ICJ under the Genocide Convention is a country whose Muslim population is less than 2%, South Africa. Less than 2% of its population is Muslim. So just compare that with the Muslim countries with huge populations and massive resources. That's the second point that I want to make. Their hypocrisy, their utter failure that has contributed to this situation. And we should bring this to the forefront and let people realize that this is happening, because there's not enough discussion and debate on this. There's no real attempt to shame them, to expose them, to tell the world this is what they are. These are the people who live off, like parasites, live off their people, and yet at the same time betray them and destroy them. Now, the third point I want to make, and the last point, is this: that if you look at the Palestinian situation itself, this is a message one directs to the Palestinian people. If you look at all the liberation movements that we have come across since the Second World War, compared to Vietnam, for instance, compared to South Africa, liberation from apartheid, Vietnam, liberation from foreign dominance, French and then American. What's the big difference? The difference is that all these liberation movements, there was unity at the top and the core was solid. In the case of Palestine, the leadership is divided. It's divided to this day. We know what the role of the Palestinian National Authority is. It acts as a surrogate for Israel. It helps Israel. It's there for that purpose. It helps to maintain control over the West Bank on behalf of Israel. That's part of the Palestinian national struggle. A group like this, utterly treacherous, no credibility at all, but they are there. And they keep the Palestinian struggle divided. On the other hand, you have got Hamas and the Islamic Jihad. Of course, they're on the same page on many issues, but nonetheless, they're two different organizations. But the Palestinian Liberation Front, called Hamas, it has quite a bit of support, we know that. But nonetheless, there is a segment of Palestinian society that supports the Palestinian National Authority. They're divided. How do you fight against a power like Israel, backed by the United States of America, if you're not united? You're not united at the most essential level, at the level of leadership. You're not united. And you can be easily divided. For instance, if you look at Gaza now, one of the solutions they're thinking about, Israel and the United States of America and others, including some Arab countries that work with them. In fact, some of the Arab countries have talked about this in public. They're thinking of creating a situation where Gaza can be handed over to the PNA, the Palestinian National Authority, in order to push aside Hamas. And the PNA doesn't have the support of the masses. But this is one of the things that they're planning. Why? Because the Palestinian struggle is divided. They're at odds with one another, the important elements in that struggle. So there has to be that unity. And the Palestinian people should insist upon this unity. And they're not doing that. Others should insist upon this unity. Of course, in the midst of all that's been happening, we have not been able to focus upon this. But nonetheless, this is an important issue. Very often, those of us who have talked about the Palestinian struggle for a long while, we have highlighted this, that a divided Palestinian national movement is a tragedy. And it's one of the reasons why they've not been able to advance, why they've not been able to achieve the goals. So this is also a problem, apart from all the other points raised by Ilan and Joe and others. I think we have to keep these things in mind. The situation within Palestine, the Arab and Muslim world, and in the global West, at the level of the masses, at the level of the citizenry. These things have to change if we are going to see some results. There is no guarantee there'll be any change. There's no guarantee at all. But what we do know is that if we are committed to a struggle, we have to insist upon integrity and courage from ourselves, from those who are in the struggle itself, rather than people outside the struggle. This is what we need: integrity and courage, the ability to work together, the ability to be more focused about one's goals, and to translate words into actions. Deeds speak louder than words. And we have to prove this. This is the struggle that we have committed ourselves to. And this is what we have to do for the sake of the children of Gaza, for the sake of other children all over the world. Whenever children are massacred, let's remember Gaza. Let us remember the betrayal of us adults. And we're all ashamed, and we ask for forgiveness from those children. Like the poem written by Palestinian, that heaven is full of children, because so many children have been killed. And all that we can do, as the poet says, is ask for their forgiveness, because we are faithful. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Muzaffar. Professor Kamdiri had to leave, so we'll not have him in the Q&A session. But we have got some interesting questions for Q&A. The first one is from an MLN member itself, Ranjan. So Ranjan asked, is there any possibility from UN, as bad as important as it is, to have a kind of a protection force or for Gaza, or have some international observers placed in Gaza to better correspond the situation is? So in your analysis, Dr. Muzaffar and Professor Pape, do you think there is a possibility that something like that can be achieved in the near future?
Thank you, Ranjan, for this question. I don't see it happening easily. Any kind of multinational presence, given the fact that I think that as the balance of power stands now, locally and regionally and even internationally, I cannot see anyone but Israel determining what is happening in the day after in Gaza. And from the Israeli perspective, any presence of forces which are not the Israeli army itself, or Palestinian forces like the PA, is something that they would reject. So the question is really connected to all our three interventions, I think. How far would the international community, how far would the Arab world, the region, be involved in shaping Gaza in the day after? And that, of course, connects to the more general question we discussed, how much the region and the international community are able to tame Israel, restrict its intentions, its policies. But if it's left to the Israelis and the Americans, I don't think that they are interested in international forces. Israel is in the mood now of using force where force didn't succeed, then using more force. And therefore, I'm sure this will come up as a suggestion, but if you look at the American plans as they are unfolding in front of our eyes, they do not include an international force. They include a kind of an agreement that would resemble, that's what they hope, the situation in Gaza to the one that exists in the West Bank.
Nida, very quickly, I agree with the sentiments expressed by Prof. Inan Pape. International Peace Force or International Protection Force, it has been established in other situations, but very different from that of Palestine. So I don't see this happening because there has to be some support from a major actor for an international peace force to be established. It was done in the case of the Yugoslav crisis. A little late in the day, but a sort of peace force, protection force was sent to Bosnia. And the United States of America supported it. Don't forget that. And they played a big role in articulating this publicly, the US, because it was Russia that was on the side of the Serbs and Germany closer to the Croats and so on. But the US was backing the Bosnians to some extent. So force was set up. But now the situation is very different. And because both Israel and the United States of America, they rule the world, to put it very crudely. They are not the majority. In fact, the majority are against them, as you can see from all the expressions of opposition to what is happening in Gaza and their role in Gaza, the role of Israel and the United States of America, but nonetheless they carry on because they control, they dominate the world. I mean, this is the sad, the tragic reality that confronts us.
Hello,
So I don't see,
uh,
Nida, I don't see this.
Dr. Muzaffar?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Oh.
Is it okay?
Yeah. There was some problem with the sound. We did not hear the last sentence, I think.
No, I'll just repeat it. I was saying that I don't see an international protection force being established because even if, let's say, someone comes up with this idea, it will be something that is tailored to the interests of the United States and Israel.
Okay. Okay, so the second question is more of a suggestion for MLN at large from Leila Pasha that MLN should organize a global, creative and powerful campaign, especially with the young leader with respect to all that we have aligned to. In a sense, she's asking that there has to be more engagement with young leaders. Okay, we'll keep this and think about it. My second question would follow from what we have, the question that Ranjan raised. Like with respect to Yugoslav crisis, and I was reading from Francis Boyle's statement on it, and he used the same genocide convention to get a protective measure in Bosnia-Herzegovina. If suppose the ICJ ruling comes comes with some sort of a protective measure for Palestinian people, even in that situation there cannot be a possibility for a protection force because the same route was taken in the history before and there was this result. So how far is the balance of power in Palestinian case different from, say, the last precedent when this rule was taken with respect to ICJ?
Yes, well, I think this is something we have actually talked a lot about in our webinars in the MLN, and if you go to the website, I think you'll see some good material on it. Israel enjoys an exceptional standing in the international community, and that includes the ability so far to ignore injunctions, rulings, and so on that Serbs in ex-Yugoslavia could not ignore, that countries or leaders in other parts of the world had to abide to. And therefore, I come back to my original point. I have no doubt that the international community, through the ICJ process that may have an additional chapters in the United Nations, would build up a certain reasonable, valid idea of how to stop the carnage, how to maybe create conditions, better conditions for life in the Gaza Strip and so on. But however, this is not enough to impose these good ideas on the reality in the ground. We have to understand that even if the United States, in a kind of wishy-washy way, would endorse part of these suggestions by the international community of an international force, of any kind of monitoring from the outside by observers and so on, even the United States would, as the Americans say, might talk the talk but would not walk the walk. Namely, it would not sanction Israel, it would not pressure Israel, and that's what the Israelis are looking at. Not at the words, not at the discourse, but at the effectiveness of actions. And so far they were right that the international community, that is at the level of governments, not on societies, at the level of governments, at the level of international organization, do not have the will or do not have the power or don't have both to force Israel to act in a way that it doesn't deem beneficiary for it. And from the Israeli point of view, they want to settle the Gaza issue as they see it through their own activities, by their own volition. And that's very bad news, of course, because they are divided between two plans that both of them are disastrous. One is the more right-wing part of the Israeli political elite that wants to fully ethnically cleanse the Gaza Strip and send the Palestinians outside of the Gaza and Judaize it again, namely rebuilding Jewish settlements in it, and the more pragmatic side of the government that wants to annex to Israel part of the Gaza Strip and rebuild in the rest a model that is similar to the model of the PA, with the help of the PA in the Gaza Strip. This is the horizon as far as Israel is concerned. Can the international community interfere with Israel's plans for the future? So far, it had totally failed in doing it. And Dr. Chandra gave us an idea where it can come from. And when it comes from there, then maybe we will see a different reality. But as the balance of power stands now, as the constellation of power is now, I don't see any change there.
I would agree with Ilan's position on this. I don't think anything will happen, even if the ICJ comes up with an interim report, which is expected in a week or two, and then they come up with very specific measures, as it was done in previous cases, but it won't be enforced because Israel will just ignore those things. They'll ignore those things because the United States is behind her, and a number of European governments are behind her, and they would feel that no one is going to force them. So they'll just ignore them. It would be a great tragedy unless, of course, there is an uprising within Israel, which is not going to happen. So it is a very bleak situation that confronts us as far as action is concerned at this stage. But in the medium term, in the long run, it may be different. But short term, I think it's quite bleak.
We have about 5 minutes more for taking the questions. There's a question by Memuna Mullah. The other two is simply an endorsement of suggestions that have been made already. There's a second question which I think our audience wants to listen a little more on. That there's a campaign by some section that says October 7 as a mindless attack. Essentially, Memuna wants to talk a little about that larger context of the October 7. And she has asked for the comments from the panelists with regard to it, that as if that October 7 happened out of nowhere.
The question is, has the 7th of October event came out of nowhere?
She's saying that there's a campaign by the sections which sees this as October 7 as a mindless attack. So, and she wants to say...
I got it, Nida. Yeah, I got it. I understand it. I think there are two competing narratives about the 7th of October. One is the one that Israel propagates, that the only way of explaining it is by looking at savages and barbarians who kill for the sake of killing, has to do with culture, has to do with religion, has to do with anti-Semitism, extending it to the Nazi period and connecting it. This is the narrative that Israel spans. Sometimes they have a more sophisticated one that connects the 7th of October to Iran and its regional ideas of destroying Israel and taking over the Middle East. But I think most reasonable people, most people with a modicum of knowledge and decency in them, would go along with the Secretary General of the United Nations when he said that the things of the 7th of October did not occur within a vacuum. And by that, he meant that there is an historical context, and we already discussed it, so I won't repeat it. There is a clear historical context, both the one that extends to 48 and the one that is more recent about the years of siege and bombardments and assaults of the Palestinians. And there is also a moral context by which we can condemn actions of anti-colonialist and liberation movement, but we are not losing the fact that these kinds of condemnations do not invalidate our total support and solidarity with the liberation movement that happened in history. Anti-colonialism anywhere in the world is not a pharmaceutical project. It can be bloody, it can be violent. There could be violations of international law also by the anti-colonialist movements. But what matters is that their violence is a symptom and not the source of the violence. The source of the violence is oppression, siege, and colonialism.
Okay.
Anita, if I may add to that by saying that there should be an external body that is independence and that is credibility to investigate what really happened on 7th of October. At the moment, the narrative which a lot of people accept, even those who are critical of Israel, is actually the Israeli narrative. And it has been shown to be false in many respects. They started off with 45 babies killed.
Yeah.
Then they discovered there was not a single baby. And perhaps one baby who had died, but not related directly to the episode. And the same thing about women being raped and so on.
Yeah.
A lot of stories, And if you look at Israel's record, one is not being anti-Semitic by saying this. If you look at their record in a very cold and analytical manner, lying and lying and lying has been so much a part of Israeli politics. And this is what we have witnessed in the case of 7th of October too. I think a lot of lies that they've said and they've been caught out and then they change the story, like in the case of the murder of Shireen Akli. They lied and they changed the story 4 times. But until now, they've not admitted that actually she was killed by an Israeli bullet. So you see, October 7th demands a thorough investigation. Why? Because it is the Israeli narrative about October 7th that is used as the basis for a lot of the things they're doing now. They say, oh, this is why we have to act this way. We're dealing with barbarians. We're dealing with rapists and people like that. But let's find out what really happened. And if it's possible, a totally independent body should investigate this and make its report known to the world. Thank you.
I think we have time for one last question. How can the Global South join in actions initiated by South Africa? In a way, like what can be the one or as specific as you can be, 1 or 2 things that the Global South can do at the moment to give more mileage to what South Africa has been doing? 1 or 2.
I will leave this. Yeah, I will leave this to Dr. Chandra. I think he already talked about it, but probably the viewer wants some more concrete evidence. I will leave it to Dr. Chandra. I think he knows exactly how to answer that.
I'm not sure if I can, but if I had to be a little more concrete than what I'd said earlier, I would put it this way, because it's something that people are all aware of. Let's look at the boycott, divest, sanctions movement. Because it's become a global movement, it has had some success. Let us see how each of us in different parts of the world, how we can help strengthen that movement. Because that's concrete. Take real action against governments. To give you a simple example, my own country, we have no diplomatic relations, Malaysia, with Israel. So there's no official trade and, exchange and all the rest of it, which is good. But we have companies in Malaysia, important companies, multinationals, that have huge investments in Israel. And they're also here. Now, can't we think of some way of acting against them, of forcing their hand on certain issues and saying, look, we would like to see you do better in the case of Israel. Withdraw your support, your investments, reduce investments. Don't forget, a number of major companies had done that as a result of public pressure. It is just amazing, how the BDS had worked in that sense. It's a movement that started off in a very quiet way. It's an indigenous Palestinian movement, and they've done well. So I think let us look at BDS, the things they're doing, how they're related to our own country in terms of indirect trade and indirect investments and relationships and all the rest of it. Sometimes it may be something like a scholarship, or it may be a certain meeting that an academic attends, it may be things which are not that dramatic. But if we can pinpoint some of these things and act on them, that I think would be good. So we can do things of that sort. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Musafir. So with this, we come to the end of the webinar. I'll quickly summarize what has happened here because I think there was a lot. And for viewers' benefit, it's better that we go through things earlier. So the first speaker laid out the 5 indications that this is the beginning of the end. Thankfully, hopefully. There's a civil war in Israel, change in the public perception throughout the world, change in the Jews as well. Then there is, according to Professor Pape's analysis, an attempt for the various factions of Palestinian national movements to finally join in. And there's a change in the position of Global South in a sense that there's more spine that we can see right now. And then from Professor Camilleri, we saw a lot of specifics in the term what can be done. So he started off first with the global north. And global north, I think, is everything that has been talked so often, that the government should have maximum pressure, target wherever is necessary, stop all kinds of military support and political support, and of course, firmly support South Africa's application. For the global south and the Arab world and the Muslim world, more deeds than words. Words are not enough. And then there are certain things that Professor Camilleri outlined which can be done outright at the UN level, especially from non-alignment movement and Islamic societies that is sharply worded UN resolutions. And as he put it, isolate, isolate, isolate Israel. And then there has been talked also from Professor Camilleri and also Dr. Musafir, as he said in the end, with respect to October 7, that there has to be some sort of an international truth-finding committees which are able to see what is the situation in historical Palestine right now and what has happened since October 7 and on October 7 specifically. Then with Dr. Musafir, Dr. Musafir reminded us again that there are 2 important weapons which are still in the hands of the Arab world and the Muslim world at large, waterways and the oil, which can, if used effectively, can help us within a week or more than that, within 2 days, to bring a lot of pressure on Israel to stop things at hand. So these are some of the finer points that we have gathered together. I'm sure this is one of the many talks which we'll be having on this. So thank you all for tuning in and listening to us. And this means a lot at the moment that we are in with respect to still the ongoing genocide in Gaza. Please check the MLN page. We'll be posting this video and a lot more accordingly. Thank you all, thank you our panelists, and thank you everyone who has joined us from all parts of the world.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nida. Thank you. And as Nida said, please check out on the share of the screen right now, the Facebook page as well as the website for the Movement for Liberation for Nakba, where you can also check out our previous videos and also our previous webinars. So once again, thank you to Dr. Chandra, Professor Joseph Camilleri, and to Professor Pape for joining us today. And thank you, Nida, for moderating. We will see you all next time in our next webinar. And for those questions who haven't been answered, we will be forwarding to our respective panelists, which may also become the subject of our next webinar discussion. So thank you again, once again. Thank you everyone for joining us. See you next time.